At my son's wedding, he grabbed my arm in front of hundreds of high society guests and shouted, "Get out, Dad. My fiancé does not want you here." I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I simply walked away in absolute silence, holding back the storm. The very next morning, he called me, his voice frantic and desperate. "Dad, I need the ranch keys and the deed right now." I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp Montana air and told him 4 words he will never forget. "You own absolutely nothing." There I was seated alone near the back of the grand ballroom at the Blue Ridge Country Club, an establishment where the annual membership fee surpassed what most working families brought home in 10 years. The whole space announced itself as a shrine to excess. Gilded iron chandeliers, each as wide as a dining table, hung from the vaulted ceilings, throwing a sharp, cold brilliance down onto cascading floral towers of imported white peonies and rare gardenias. Silk draped every surface, polished silver caught every glimmer of light. What I had on was a navy blue suit I had purchased 12 years ago. Spotless, pressed flat and plainly behind the times. My leather boots carried scuffs at the toe from years of covering the rough, uneven terrain of my land. A man like me had no natural place in a room built on performative fortune. The air itself seemed to register the mismatch. None of that held my attention, though. I wasn't there to admire the chandeliers. Welcome back to Alpha Dad Stories. I'm glad you found your way here today. If stories like this one stay with you long after they're over, I'd be grateful if you hit like and subscribed. It means more than you know. And before we get into it, I'm curious, is it morning where you are, afternoon, or are you winding down late at night? Wherever you are in your day, I hope this story finds you at the right moment. A note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of audio storytelling, and any resemblance to specific real individuals or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth at the heart of it. My eyes were fixed on Caden standing near the altar. He was engaged in a vicious, hushed argument with a man clutching a clipboard, some event coordinator or vendor by the look of it. Caden's face had gone crimson against the crisp white of his custom tuxedo collar, a sheen of sweat across his forehead. His fingers kept working at the heavy platinum watch on his wrist, that old nervous tell he'd fallen back on whenever he found himself cornered. Serena stood beside him, his beautiful, insufferably arrogant bride-to-be. Her designer gown moved around her like liquid pearl, but her expression had collapsed into barely contained panic and fury. Even seated several rows back, the acoustics of that vast, hollow room funneled fragments of their frantic exchange straight to me. "The deposit did not clear, Mr. Alcott," the vendor said, his voice flat and without mercy. "The wire transfer bounced this morning. If the final payment is not secured before the guests arrive, my staff will begin breaking down the dining area." Caden dragged a trembling hand through his immaculate hair, pleading for a few more hours, swearing the funds were tied up in a bridging loan held back by some banking error. I sat without moving, palms resting in my lap, feeling the deep, rough calluses worn into my hands by 50 years of hard, unrelenting work. Staring at those hands, a memory rose up with a sharp, bittersweet ache. Marlene, my late wife, standing alongside me 35 years ago on a raw, wind-swept stretch of Montana dirt. We had nothing between us but a shared vision, a rusted old pickup truck, and an ironwork ethic that neither of us would compromise. Borrowed money was never part of how we operated. We were up before dawn and working long past sunset, coaxing that dry, stubborn land into a living, breathing cattle ranch. If cash wasn't in hand, the purchase didn't happen. Everything we built rested on earned respect and hard financial discipline. Now, beneath the glare of those chandeliers, I watched the 30-year-old man pacing anxiously at the altar. Caden was buried under enormous high-interest debt, all of it engineered to fund a single day of theatrical spectacle. He was suffocating himself financially just to impress a woman and a social circle that judged a man entirely by the label sewn into his jacket and the badge on his car. A deep, cold disconnection settled over me. The man up there lying to a vendor bore no resemblance to the boy Marlene and I had raised. He had pawned every bit of his integrity for the appearance of status. The vendor eventually walked away, pacified for the moment by whatever desperate assurances Caden had offered. Serena wheeled around, chest tight with stress, her gaze sweeping the empty rows of seating until it landed squarely on me. The panic drained from her face, replaced by something hard and openly contemptuous. She gathered the heavy folds of her silk gown and came down the center aisle, heels striking the marble with sharp, deliberate force. She pulled up a few feet from my pew and looked me over slowly, the way someone appraises something unpleasant that has been left where it doesn't belong. "Are you actually planning to wear that to my reception?" The question came out soaked in theatrical venom. She made no effort to keep her voice down. She wanted the event staff moving around the room to hear every syllable. I met her gaze without flinching. "It is the suit I wore to Marlene's funeral, and it is perfectly respectable." Serena answered with a sharp, contemptuous scoff and folded her arms across her lace bodice. "Respectable does not cut it today, Vernon. This entire wedding has a strict black tie aesthetic. We have a photographer from a major bridal magazine documenting this event. Those dusty boots and that cheap, ill-fitting jacket are a complete visual liability. I will not have you destroying the aesthetic of the most important day of my life looking like a homeless farmhand. You will stay entirely out of the professional family portraits. Do you understand me?" I didn't move. I didn't rise to defend my presence or explain the honest labor that had put the scuffs on those boots. I let the insult sit there in the cold, conditioned air, her staggering arrogance suspended in the silence between us. Then, at the edge of my vision, something shifted. Caden was moving quickly down the aisle toward us. He stopped roughly 2 feet behind Serena. Every word of her degrading speech had reached him. I pulled my gaze from the woman standing over me and looked at the son I had spent my life protecting. I held his eyes, offering him a quiet, defining choice. This was his moment, the chance to show some character, to tell his bride she would never speak to his father that way again. Caden looked at my face. Then he looked down at the polished marble floor. He straightened his expensive cufflinks, swallowed once, and turned his back on me. He walked away without a word, leaving me to absorb his future wife's contempt alone. The betrayal landed like a door slamming shut, total and sealed in that awful weighted silence. He had chosen the hollow vanity of a toxic woman over the dignity of the father who had given up everything for him. Within the hour, the great doors swung open and the guests began pouring in. The city's elite arranged in a parade of performative wealth. Women armored in diamonds and designer silk, men cinched into custom tuxedos, everyone speaking in loud, self-satisfied voices. I stayed in my pew watching the room fill in silence. Before long, Serena caught the eye of a young, visibly nervous usher in a stiff uniform. She pointed at me directly, whispered something sharp, and gestured toward the rear of the room. The young man swallowed, nodded, and made his way toward my seat with the look of someone who wanted to be anywhere else. He avoided eye contact as he cleared his throat. "Sir," he said quietly, shifting his weight. "The bride has requested we relocate your seat for the ceremony and the dinner service. She feels this area needs to be kept clear for the immediate bridal party and the primary sponsors." The message needed no translation. I was being methodically erased from the visual record of my own son's wedding. I didn't argue with the young man. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and followed him to the farthest corner of the ballroom, a cramped little table beside the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, surrounded by distant acquaintances and last-minute plus-ones. The seat, traditionally reserved for the father of the groom, sat conspicuously, deliberately vacant. From that banished vantage point, a tall partition laced with white roses between me and the main event, I was positioned only yards behind the ceremony's front row. Settling into those prime seats were Serena's parents, Clifford and Georgette Prescott, the very embodiment of inherited, unearned wealth, layered in condescension. The room's acoustics near that partition delivered their hushed, cruel remarks to me with crystalline precision. They were glancing back over their shoulders, eyes trained on my isolated table by the kitchen doors. Clifford let out a dry, dismissive laugh that cut cleanly through the ambient music. "Look at him back there," he whispered to his wife, shaking his head with undisguised disgust. Caden was not exaggerating in the slightest. The man literally looks like a hired farmhand who wandered in from the stables looking for a free meal. Georgette replied with the long, heavy sigh of rehearsed false pity. "It is tragic, really. It truly is. Caden has worked so incredibly hard to elevate himself from that pathetic, dirt-poor background. Now he has to carry the financial burden of an aging penniless rancher. We will have to be very careful, Clifford. We must make absolutely sure that Caden does not start draining Serena's trust fund accounts trying to support that old man when he inevitably ends up rotting in a cheap nursing home." I sat, without moving, taking in every word from the people who had raised the toxic woman my son was about to marry. A sudden chilling clarity cut through everything. I understood in that moment that Caden had sold them an enormous calculated lie. He had painted himself to this elite circle as a self-made man, straining under the weight of a destitute, incompetent father, all to secure his position in their world. He had turned my plain, honest life into a prop, a sympathy play, to buy his place at their table. I did not rise to correct them. I did not cross the room to their front row seats and lay out the truth of the matter. I did not tell Clifford and Georgette Prescott that the checking account bearing my name could comfortably buy the entire country club they were sitting in, golf course included. I simply accepted the humiliating arrangement. I folded my calloused hands in my lap and kept my gaze fixed forward. What had started as a private stinging slight had grown into open, deliberate public exclusion. The son I had loved, the boy I had taught to fish and ride, no longer existed. Standing in his place was a desperate, dishonest man who took whatever he needed. The last remaining thread of my parental obligation snapped cleanly in that moment. I felt no grief, no heartbreak reached me. What remained was a cold, precise, and total detachment. The reception washed past me in a blinding blur of expensive champagne and empty laughter. I stayed put at my assigned table near the kitchen's swinging doors, watching the spectacle play out across the room from a distance. The band drove a loud, vibrant set that ricocheted off the high-vaulted ceilings. Waiters in pressed white uniforms streamed past, carrying silver trays of smoked salmon and prime rib. I barely touched whatever was set before me. My attention was locked entirely on a single remaining obligation. Folded inside the inner breast pocket of my jacket was a piece of paper, a short speech. Written weeks earlier at the heavy oak table back on the ranch, alone and without ceremony. Nothing grand or poetic about it, just an honest, traditional toast from the father of the groom. Despite Serena's cutting remarks and the deliberate isolation I had endured throughout the day, a deep and firm sense of duty told me those words still needed to be spoken. I was doing it for Marlene. My late wife would have expected me to stand and mark the milestone of our only child's wedding. She would have wanted me to show these people what genuine dignity looked like. I pushed back my chair and got to my feet. The heavy fabric of my old suit pulled across my broad shoulders as I threaded through the maze of crowded tables. Not one person paid me any notice. The affluent guests were too occupied performing their own importance for one another. I moved steadily toward the raised stage where the wedding band had just wrapped their opening set. A single microphone waited on a metal stand at center stage, ready for the traditional toasts to begin. I climbed the wooden steps. The floorboards gave a faint creak beneath my worn leather boots. I drew the folded paper from my pocket and smoothed the creases flat with my rough thumbs. I looked out across a sea of faces, hundreds of strangers, bathed in warm, golden, ambient light. Gradually, heads began turning my way. Loud conversations softened into a puzzled murmur as people registered the old man standing alone at the microphone. I shifted my focus to the center of the massive head table. Caden sat there, a crystal glass of champagne suspended halfway to his mouth. He went completely still, his eyes wide with undisguised terror at the sight of me. He was clearly convinced the rough farmhand was about to make a spectacle of him in front of his wealthy new family. I leaned in and tapped the microphone head. A dull thud rolled through the speakers and settled over the room. I drew a slow, steady breath and prepared to deliver the first words of honor I owed my son. But before a single syllable could leave my mouth, a rush of white silk cut across the stage. Serena. She moved with frantic urgency and wrenched the microphone clean off its stand before I could react. She did not look at me. She did not acknowledge that I was standing directly beside her. She snapped a wide, entirely artificial smile across her face and angled her whole body toward the crowd. She projected her voice brightly into the microphone, welcoming everyone with gushing warmth. Her tone was shrill and relentlessly cheerful. The sudden outburst jolted the room, but she didn't lose a step. She informed the hundreds of guests that tradition normally called for lengthy family speeches at this moment in the evening. Then she laughed a bright and hollow sound. She announced that she and Caden had agreed to skip the tedious parts entirely. Tonight was about dancing and celebrating. She called to the band to keep the energy alive and bring the music back hard. The room erupted in cheers and applause, utterly unaware of the calculated humiliation that had just been carried out on that stage. The band crashed back in, with a high-tempo song obliterating any chance I had of speaking or reclaiming my ground. I stood motionless, my small, unread speech still in hand. Serena pivoted to face me, and the manufactured smile collapsed instantly into a vicious, hateful sneer. She leaned close enough that I could catch her sharp words beneath the blaring music. She told me to step down and said I had already done enough damage for one day. Then she turned away and swept off the stage, where a cluster of cheering bridesmaids absorbed her immediately. I did not move. I looked past the dancing crowd and fixed my gaze directly on the head table. Caden was staring straight back at me. He had seen everything his wife had just done. He had watched the worst kind of disrespect land on his own father in public without interference. And still he did nothing. He simply dropped his eyes from mine, lifted his champagne in a long, nervous swallow, and sank lower in his padded chair, using the towering white floral centerpieces as a screen to hide behind. Watching the cowardly man shelter himself behind those expensive flowers, my mind dragged me back 20 years without warning. A crisp autumn morning on the dirt trails of the ranch. Caden was 10 years old, perched on the back of a stubborn, unbroken gelding named Cobalt. The horse bucked without warning and sent the boy hard into the dry Montana dirt. Caden sat there in the dust, crying and too frightened to climb back into the saddle. I walked over and pulled him to his feet, brushed the dust from his small denim jeans. I didn't coddle him. I told him that fear was a natural thing, but letting fear steer his choices was something he had to refuse. I told him a man earns respect by planting his feet, meeting the challenge eye to eye, and getting back on the horse. 10-year-old Caden had dragged a dirty sleeve across his face. He had given me a single firm nod and swung himself right back up into that leather saddle. He had looked down at me with complete trust and something close to reverence shining in his eyes. The boy on that horse 20 years ago had been brave, and his integrity had been real. The man seated at the head table today was nothing but a coward. He had traded his backbone and his character for a designer tuxedo and a borrowed position in a world built entirely on hollow smiles and checks that couldn't clear. The weight of it landed on me like a physical blow. The son I had raised was gone completely and irreversibly. I folded my unread speech slowly and returned it to the inner pocket of my jacket. I turned and descended the wooden steps, walking away from the noise and the blinding lights for the last time. I stepped down from the wooden stage and moved away from the flashing lights. The air inside the grand ballroom pressed down heavy and stifling. I wound through the clusters of circular tables, sidestepping the careless elbows of dancing guests and the waiters rushing past with laden silver trays. I had no intention of making a scene. I only wanted a quiet moment to collect myself before I made my final exit. A shadowed space opened up near a massive marble pillar a few yards from the vacant head table. I positioned myself there, back straight, hands resting in my pockets. I took in the frantic spectacle of performative wealth spinning out in front of me. The band hammered through a brass-heavy number that pulsed up through the floorboards. Serena was holding a crystal flute of pale gold champagne. The liquid trembled near the rim of the delicate glass with each unsteady step she took. A tight cluster of bridesmaids surrounded her, moving together, like a well-dressed pack wrapped in matching sage-green satin. Serena was clearly drunk. The composed, calculating woman I had observed earlier in the day had given way to a flushed and reckless one running on alcohol and the arrogance of a social victory she thought she'd secured. She spotted me standing in the shadow of the marble pillar. Her eyes found mine, and the malicious intent flared up instantly. She redirected herself, shouldering past a waiter and heading straight for my corner of the room. Her bridesmaids trailed close behind, whispering to one another behind manicured hands. They fanned out into a suffocating half-circle, pressing me against the cold stone at my back. The combined assault of their heavy floral perfumes and the sharp tang of alcohol was almost physical. Serena took a large, sloppy pull from her crystal flute and made no effort to lower her voice. If anything, she pitched it deliberately over the band, so the guests at the nearby tables caught every syllable. "I thought I told you to stay out of sight, Vernon," she said, her tone thick with a syrupy, toxic condescension. "Why are you hovering near the head table like some stray dog angling for table scraps? Are you hoping someone takes pity on you and passes you a plate?" I said nothing. I looked down at her flushed face and held a cold, unyielding stare. My refusal to retreat poured fuel directly onto her drunken rage. She stepped closer, breaching my space, and leveled a manicured finger at the lapel of my outdated jacket. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing you are to us?" she demanded loud enough that heads turned. "Do you know how much money my parents spent to make this venue look absolutely flawless? Every detail in this room is perfect. And then there is you, a walking visual disaster. You contribute absolutely nothing to this family. Not a single dollar toward this wedding. Not a single cent toward your own son's future. You just occupy space and breathe the same air as everyone else." The guests at the adjacent tables had begun to take notice. The clink of silverware against fine china wound down to nothing. The boastful conversations of the wealthy crowd dissolved into a tense and uncomfortable stillness. They were riveted by the spectacle playing out in front of them. Serena felt the weight of those eyes on her back, and she leaned into it. She was performing for her affluent audience, intent on demonstrating her dominance over the poor, pathetic father of the groom. "Caden is entirely ashamed of you," she announced, her words slicing through the air. Do you really think he wanted you here today? Do you genuinely believe he wanted to look across this beautiful room and see the man who kept him trapped in poverty throughout his entire childhood? He complains about you constantly, Vernon. He tells me how you refused to modernize, how you clung stubbornly to that worthless patch of dirt while he was trying desperately to build something real. He tells me how you are a financial anchor dragging him under. We are drowning in expenses, and you just sit there expecting us to carry your weight. Her bridesmaids offered soft, mocking sounds of agreement. One of them pressed a hand over her mouth to conceal a cruel smile. I kept my gaze fixed on Serena and let nothing show on my face. Inside my mind was quietly cataloging every detail she was volunteering without realizing it. She was confirming everything I had already suspected. Caden had cast himself as the victim of my supposed financial failures. He had rewritten our entire family history to fuel his own desperate social climb. We only invited you out of pity. Serena pressed on her voice, carrying clearly across the now silent dining room. We had lengthy discussions about leaving you off the guest list entirely, but it would have looked terrible in the society photographs if the groom had no father present. People would have asked questions. It would have generated rumors. So we brought you here as a prop. A pathetic little charity case to make Caden look like a devoted and forgiving son. We gave you a plate of food and tucked you in the back so nobody would have to smell the dirt on your boots. And you could not even manage that right. You had to climb up on that stage and attempt a speech. You had to go and pretend that you actually belong in a room with these people. She swept her champagne flute in a wide arc toward the watching guests. The liquid sloshed over the rim and hit the polished floor. Nobody moved to address it. The music from the band seemed to recede, entirely swallowed by the sheer weight of what was happening. Serena advanced another aggressive step. You are nothing to him now, she sneered, abandoning any pretense of restraint. You are just an old, broken man who failed his family. Caden is a Prescott now. He belongs to my family. He belongs to this world. You have no place in his future whatsoever. I want you to walk out through those front doors and go back to that miserable little place you call a home. I want you to sit there in the dirt and accept the fact that your son has outgrown you. He does not need you. He does not love you. He simply pities you. The silence that settled after her monologue was dense and absolute. The tension in that room was thick enough to press against your skin. Dozens of wealthy guests held their breath, watching to see how the humiliated old rancher would answer being publicly dismantled in front of high society. Georgette and Clifford Prescott observed from their prime seats with expressions of smug satisfaction. The bridesmaids stared at me with wide, expectant eyes. I did not raise my hand. I did not raise my voice. I stood there and absorbed the full tragic weight of what my son had allowed his life to become. The venom coming out of Serena's mouth was not the source of my pain. It was the confirmation of my freedom. She believed she was shredding me. In reality, she was handing me the key to walk out the door. She was showing me in clear and unmistakable terms exactly what had infected my family. I processed her words with the cold precision of a surgeon reading a terminal diagnosis. I studied her flushed, arrogant face, and I waited. I waited because I understood the scene was not finished. The true and final betrayal could not come from this woman. It had to come from the man I had raised. The crowd stayed frozen in a state of morbid fascination. The cruelty of Serena's public execution hung in the air, throwing a shadow across the gilded chandeliers and the white floral arrangements. I remained an immovable presence against that pillar. I would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I would not allow her to see weakness in me. The silence stretched out past what felt reasonable. I could make out the faint sound of ice shifting in unattended cocktail glasses. The waiters had gone completely still, pressed against the paneled walls. The guests at the nearest tables leaned imperceptibly forward, unable to look away. I could see the chandelier light reflecting in Serena's hateful eyes. Her chest was heaving, rising and falling as she waited for me to crack. She wanted me to shout. She wanted a scene she could use the unstable, aggressive old man, removed by security, branded and dismissed. She wanted the perfect justification to have me thrown out. But I had spent a lifetime breaking wild horses and riding out Montana blizzards. I knew how to hold my ground in a storm. I looked at her with a chilling, absolute emptiness. I did not see a beautiful bride. I saw a hollow and frightened creature who measured her entire worth by the price tags on her clothes and the figures in her accounts. I saw a woman so consumed by insecurity that publicly humiliating a 70-year-old man was the only way she could feel a fleeting trace of power. My silence was a weapon she had no answer for. The longer I stood there without flinching, the more her confident smile began to weaken. The smug certainty on her bridesmaids' faces curdled into something closer to unease. They shifted on their expensive heels, trading uncertain looks with one another. They had expected an easy target. They had anticipated a broken, weeping old man desperate for his son's approval. Instead, they were standing in front of a wall that didn't move. I slowly pulled my gaze away from Serena and let it travel across the sea of silent, staring guests. I made deliberate, unhurried eye contact with the wealthy onlookers who had found such rich entertainment in my public humiliation. I watched them flinch and look away, dropping their eyes to their expensive plates, or discovering a sudden fascination with their crystal wine glasses. Cowards. Every last one of them. They inhabited a world where cruelty was perfectly acceptable, provided it was delivered by someone in a designer gown. My gaze eventually settled on the head table at the far end of the room. The tension in that space had reached a boiling point. The entire grand ballroom was suspended in held breath, waiting for the inevitable end to this degrading spectacle. I stood without moving, feeling the familiar weight of my old suit and the comfort of my scuffed leather boots against the floor. I was prepared for whatever came. I had weathered 50 years of drought and hardship on the ranch. A room full of parasites was not going to break me. I steadied myself for the final confrontation, knowing the last fracture in my family was only moments away. The heavy quiet was broken by the sound of rapid footsteps. I kept my eyes forward and watched the crowd pull apart like water dividing. Caden was moving toward me at speed. His posture was rigid, his face drained to the color of chalk. He looked less like a groom at his wedding reception and more like a man walking toward something he dreaded. He pushed past a few lingering waiters and entered the small clearing near the marble pillar where Serena and her bridesmaids had cornered me. I studied the man bearing down on me and searched his face for any trace of the boy I had raised out on the ranch. I looked for shame or the spark of something righteous. I waited for him to turn on the toxic woman beside me and insist that she treat his father like a human being. I held perfectly still and gave him the silent opening to reclaim himself in front of this roomful of arrogant strangers. He did not look at Serena. He did not reprimand her or wave her bridesmaids back. Caden came straight at me and raised both hands. His fingers locked hard around my forearm. The grip was jarring in its immediacy. His hands were soft and carefully maintained, unacquainted with any kind of real physical labor. They trembled against the thick fabric of my old jacket. I looked down at where he held me, then brought my eyes up to meet his. His pupils were blown wide with panic. He was sweating through his tuxedo, and the expensive cologne he wore had been overtaken entirely by the bitter scent of his fear. He was terrified of losing the hollow world he had just married into. He was terrified that the watching crowd would see through the facade and recognize him for what he was, a desperate fraud built on borrowed money and fabricated identity. He tightened his grip and tried to steer me toward the exit. I planted my boots into the polished floor and did not give him an inch. I held his gaze and forced him to take full possession of what he was about to do. Caden swallowed hard, his jaw trembling. He leaned his face close to mine and released the words that would sever our bond for the remainder of our lives. "Get out, Dad!" he shouted, voice fracturing under the weight of his own cowardice. "My fiancé does not want you here." He did not murmur it. He threw his voice across the room so that the demand bounced off the gilded chandeliers and rolled through the vaulted ceilings. He wanted his new family to hear it clearly. He wanted Clifford and Georgette Prescott to know he was willing to cut his own father loose in exchange for a permanent seat at their table. The words settled into the thick air of the ballroom. They landed against my chest with the force of something physical, but they did not destroy me. What they did was shatter the last remaining illusion I had been carrying about my son. In those few agonizing seconds, the bond that had tied me to Caden for 30 years broke cleanly apart. The deep paternal love I had carried since the day he was born dissolved into the cold, conditioned air of that room. It left behind a strange, hollow sensation. No grief reached me. No crushing wave of sorrow, only emptiness. I looked at the stranger whose hand was still on my arm. I looked past the designer tuxedo and the heavy platinum watch and the carefully arranged hair. I looked directly into his core and found nothing there, nothing but a hollow, desperate man running on fear. I met him with a stare so cold and devoid of feeling that it contained no anger and no appeal. It was the look a man gives something already dead. Caden felt the total withdrawal of my love. The frantic energy left his face, and his lower lip began to tremble. He tried to hold his aggressive posture, but his soft fingers gradually released their hold on my forearm. He couldn't sustain my gaze past 3 seconds. His eyes dropped to his polished shoes, unable to bear the weight of his own failure. I did not spend a single word on a ghost. I turned my back on Caden and Serena and started the long walk toward the heavy oak doors at the front of the country club. The crowd of wealthy guests parted immediately, opening a wide, unobstructed lane to the exit. I walked at a slow and measured pace. My scuffed boots struck the marble floor in a steady rhythm, each step like the tick of a clock, marking the close of an era. No one spoke. The band held its silence on the stage. The waiters hadn't moved from the walls. Hundreds of eyes tracked my solitary passage across that vast room. I kept my head up and my shoulders square. I looked neither left nor right. I paid no attention to the pitying expressions or the smug faces of those who believed they had just watched my destruction. I reached the grand entrance and pressed against the brass handles. The oak doors gave way, and I walked out of the suffocating vanity of that ballroom into the clean, cold air of the Montana night. The drop in temperature struck my face like a dousing of ice water. I crossed the sprawling parking lot, moving past row after row of imported luxury sedans and gleaming sports cars. My rusted, dependable pickup sat under a flickering amber lamp in the far corner of the lot. I pulled open the heavy metal door and settled into the driver's seat. The smell of motor oil and worn leather enveloped me like something familiar and safe, the smell of honest work, of a life lived straight. I shut the door and locked it, sealing out the poisonous world I had just left behind. I sat in the dark for a long while, staring through the dusty windshield at the lit facade of the country club. My hands rested on the steering wheel. I expected the pain to come. I waited for the wave of sorrow a father is supposed to feel when he loses his only child. It never arrived. The hollow place in my chest did not fill with grief. It filled instead with a clean, razor-sharp, tactical clarity. Whatever emotional fog had been clouding my thinking over the past year burned completely away. I began turning the situation over with the cold precision of a predator, reading the ground ahead. I thought about Caden and that frantic argument with the wedding vendor earlier in the day. I thought about the bounced wire transfer and the bridging loan he had scrambled to explain. The pieces assembled themselves with terrifying clarity. Caden was entirely bankrupt. He had leveraged everything he had and everything he didn't have to sustain a life he could not afford. He was buried under enormous high-interest debt. And then the most important piece fell into place. I understood exactly how he had managed to secure those massive loans in the first place. He had used my land. He had put up the sprawling acres of the ranch as collateral, operating on the assumption that he was the rightful and legal heir to the property. In his mind, I was nothing, a doddering old squatter camped on acreage his dead wife had left in the dirt. His whole crooked empire stood on the single arrogant conviction that the deed to my valley bore his name. Sitting alone in the cab of my truck, the truth of what had just happened settled over me like cold iron. Caden hadn't merely dismissed me. He had made a deliberate move to plunder the legacy that Marlene and I had carved from this earth with our own hands. He'd thrown my home and 40 years of labor onto a bonfire, just to purchase a few hours of borrowed elegance and a room full of people pretending to admire him. There are lines a man crosses that erase the road back entirely. He had crossed one. I turned the key and the old engine answered with a low, bone-deep growl that rolled up through the floor of the cab. I pulled the truck into gear and eased out of the country club parking lot without looking back. In the mirror, the chandelier glow and the elaborate flower towers shrank until they disappeared into the dark. I took the long, winding mountain roads home through the blackness back toward the valley that answered to no name but mine. My thoughts weren't grief. They were architecture. I wasn't the broken-hearted father who had walked into that ballroom anymore. I was a man of considerable means who had just watched an adversary reveal exactly where he was exposed. Caden and Serena were convinced they had closed the book on me the moment those doors swung shut behind my back. What they couldn't see was that humiliating me publicly had simply tripped a wire they didn't know existed. I came through the heavy iron gates of the ranch and cut the engine near the front porch of the cabin. The night pressed in from all sides, wide, dark, and dead quiet. I climbed out and stood for a moment, taking in the hills and the black sweep of pasture rolling away in every direction, as far as a man could see. Every acre of it was mine. Every creek, every fence post, every foot of it. I had built that quiet empire, one private transaction at a time, never advertising it, never needing to. The loud, gaudy performance I'd just witnessed was the life of people who needed an audience. I never did. Caden had read my stillness as stupidity. He had read my economy of words as a vacancy of thought. I stepped up onto the wooden porch and let myself in. I left the lights off. I moved through the dark house by memory straight to the back office. Behind the bookshelf, the heavy steel safe waited. I worked the combination, pulled the door open, and drew out a dense file of deeds and legal papers. I spread them across the desk and angled the small lamp to throw light across the official seals and the property lines. I pressed my rough fingertips to the paper and felt the raised edges of stamps that had survived longer than Caden's entire scheme. Everything was already in position. Caden had stacked his fragile little world on ground that had no foundation under it, and I was the one holding the water back. The debt collectors weren't a distant threat. They were close. The vendors he'd stiffed and the loan arrangements he'd made at punishing rates were going to mature fast, and there would be nowhere to run. I settled into the leather chair and let the darkness gather around me. Morning would expose everything. When daylight hit, Caden would start to feel the full weight of what he owed and understand he had no honest way out. He would scramble to push through whatever backroom property deal he'd rigged to keep himself solvent. And at some point in that spiral, the obvious move would occur to him: call the old man he'd discarded the night before. I rested my hands flat on the desk and let the clock run. My era of endurance, of absorbing insults in silence, of waiting and hoping was done. What replaced it was something quieter and far more permanent. Through the black window of my office, the moonlight drew pale lines across the floor, slow and exact as a sundial. Each click of the clock felt deliberate, like footsteps approaching a moment that couldn't be stopped. I turned the night's events over in my head, not to nurse the wound, but to map the terrain of their weaknesses. Serena's contempt brittle and performed. Caden's eyes scared underneath the bluster. Both of them were running the same engine terror of being seen clearly, terror that the mask would slip. To keep the illusion breathing, they'd feed it anything. I thought about the Prescotts perched in their front row chairs, appraising my worn boots and my suit, while the man their daughter had just married was hemorrhaging money to buy their approval. Every one of them was a single thread holding up an elaborate pretense. I was the scissors. One call, one page of documents with my signature. That was all it would take to bring the whole structure off its hinges. But I wouldn't move on rage. Impatience is the enemy of results. I would stand back and let the mountain of debt they had piled on themselves do the collapsing for me. I secured the safe with a firm twist of the lock, the mechanism seated with a clean, solid click. In the kitchen, I set up the coffee maker and laid out the mug for morning. My movements were unhurried, the way a surgeon moves, no wasted motion, no hesitation, nothing to betray the gravity of what comes next. This land was something I had given my life to, and I was not going to watch it picked apart by people who saw it only as a transaction. When I finally got into bed, the quiet of the ranch came in around me from every side. I let the cold, clear logic of what I intended finish its work in my mind. A ruined man's desperation would be knocking by morning. And when it did, 4 words from me would be enough to collapse everything he thought he had. Sleep came without struggle and without a trace of doubt. Light broke over the eastern ridge and sent long shadows stretching out across the valley floor. I was in the heavy wooden rocking chair on the wraparound porch before the frost had even begun to lift. The air had teeth, cold and clean, filling my lungs like a reminder of what was real. Both hands were wrapped around a thick ceramic mug of black coffee steam, threading upward into the still morning. My old border collie slept peacefully at my feet, blissfully ignorant of the scene I'd walked away from at the country club the night before. Out across the valley, my cattle worked their slow way over the frost-silvered pasture, grazing without urgency. Nothing on the ranch moved fast. That stillness was something I had earned across 50 years of work that never let up. The events of the previous evening had left no mark on me in the form of exhaustion. What they had left instead was something sharper, a clarity with an edge to it. The long wait of trying to reach a son who had already decided he was somewhere better, that weight was gone from me. I sipped the coffee dark and without ceremony and let the quiet hold a moment longer before the world intruded. It didn't take long. The cell phone on the small table beside the chair broke the whole morning open with a hard digital ring. It went off like a siren dropped into a church. I made no move toward it. I counted the rings. 3 of them. I could feel the desperation in the frequency itself, something frantic encoded in the sound. I set the mug down with care and lifted the phone. The name on the screen was my son's. A different kind of father, one still running on hope, might have braced himself for remorse for the stumbling apology of a young man who had slept on a bad decision and felt it in the morning. That was not what I was bracing for. Hope wasn't operating in me anymore. I swiped and raised the phone, no greeting from my end. Just breath and patience and the silence of a man prepared to let the other person show exactly what they are. He didn't disappoint. Not a word of acknowledgement for what he'd put me through, barely 12 hours earlier. No preamble, no softening, not a syllable of contrition for the spectacle he'd staged at my expense. Caden was already talking before the connection had fully settled. Fast, ragged the cadence of someone underwater. He had the tone of a man watching the walls cave in on a life built from bad math. He didn't bother with courtesy. He went straight to orders. He told me to unlock the main iron gates right now, his words piling into each other, without pause or punctuation. The surveyors, he said, would be on the property in exactly 2 hours. He wanted them to have complete access to the southern pastures. He told me to go inside and pull the original deed papers for the property and have them on the kitchen counter ready to hand off. A courier was coming by noon. No questions. No delays. Don't make this complicated. Not a word left my mouth. I held the phone steady and let him finish. The nerve of it was almost worth admiring, almost. The previous night he had staged a public ejection to keep his bride and her family satisfied, had treated me like an inconvenience to be managed and disposed of. Now with the sun barely up, he was on my land in everything but body issuing directives, like a man who had forgotten which one of us held the deeds. His panic wasn't background noise. It was the whole signal raw and leaking out of every word he pushed through the line. My silence was apparently intolerable. When no answer came, his tone pivoted from frantic to flat-out vicious. He barked into the phone, wanting to know whether I was even listening. This wasn't a request, he said. It was already decided, and it was happening today. He and his new wife had a major commercial closing locked in for Friday, and he wasn't about to let my usual obstinate dragging of feet derail it. He told me to cooperate and hand over those deed papers, full stop. I sat with the phone against my ear and listened to him breathe, fast, shallow, irregular. Behind him, I could pick out the muffled noise of street traffic, which told me he was already outside, burning off the city pavement, trying to stay one step ahead of the financial collapse bearing down on him. He never asked whether I'd made it back to the valley in one piece after being publicly expelled from his celebration. He didn't wonder how I was holding up. To him, I was simply an obstacle in a suit, an inconvenient gatekeeper standing between him and his exit. His voice climbed with each passing sentence. He needed me to understand how serious things were. Then it came the bridging loans he and Serena had taken to cover the wedding costs, and the down payment on their new condo were coming due in 3 days. The interest, he said, was brutal. The bank he went on had threatened to freeze every account they held by week's end unless they received finalized land transfer documents. The southern acreage had been put up as collateral. The commercial buyers were ready to close, but they required the physical original deed to release the escrow funds. If I didn't hand those papers to the courier today, he said they would be finished completely and utterly ruined. The arrogance embedded in that confession was something I sat with for a moment. He was standing there openly telling me he had borrowed against the very ground Marlene and I had nearly destroyed ourselves to hold on to the pastures where she and I had worked through seasons that would have broken most people. And he had done it to buy himself 1 day of theater and a seat at someone else's table. He had done it without a conversation, without my knowledge, on the assumption that the valley had already passed into his hands the moment his mother was gone. In his version of events, I was simply a placeholder, an old man marking time until the property sorted itself out. I said nothing. I let the silence unspool across the connection and watched what it did to him. A non-answer was apparently worse than any argument I could have made. I could hear his pacing pick up speed, the rhythm of his breathing going jagged and rough. He demanded that I say something, his voice fracturing under the strain of a world caving in on schedule. He wanted to know why I was doing this to him on this particular day. He accused me of making a scene at the reception, and now deliberately trying to wreck what came after. He switched to pleading, "Just do what I'm asking, just give the surveyors the access codes, just leave the deed on the counter, just don't ruin this for us." I turned my eyes out over the land laid out before me. Morning light sat on the dew-soaked grass and turned the whole valley into something that glittered. Every acre was mine. The water rights, the timber rights, the mineral rights beneath the dirt, all of it documented and held in my name. While my son had been assembling a monument to debt and performance, I had been quietly building something that would outlast both of us. Something moved in my chest, not pride exactly. Gravity. The weight of what I was holding. The young man rattling at the other end of the line had convinced himself he was the one with leverage. He saw himself running the table, issuing instructions to a confused old rancher who didn't know better. I lifted the ceramic mug and drew a slow, deliberate sip of black coffee. I held it there a moment, let the bitterness settle. No anger in me. No grief either. Just the cold attention of a man watching a defendant talk himself all the way to the verdict. Caden was begging me to hand him the instrument of my own undoing. He wanted me to clear the path, hold the door open, and smile while he walked through it. The fury in his voice reached an absolute boiling point. He abandoned urgency and went for cruelty, apparently deciding that wounding me might accomplish what pressure hadn't. He called me a selfish old man, and he put teeth in it. He accused me of sitting on land my whole life and doing absolutely nothing with it, hoarding it like a miser while the world moved on without me. He had a future, he said. He had actual plans. The capital from that sale was what they needed to lock in their position in the city. After the embarrassing spectacle I'd made of myself at the wedding, he told me the very least I could do was hand over the papers and stop playing these ridiculous silent games. I set the coffee mug down against my thigh and rested my hand on the warm ceramic. The morning air moved across the porch, carrying pine and wet soil. I had given him room to run, and he had used every inch of it. He had laid bare his greed and peeled back every layer without any help from me. He had confirmed the bridge loans were tied directly to my land. He had confirmed the sale couldn't close without the physical deed in his hand. He had drawn me the exact map of his house of cards, marked every weak point, and handed it over freely. I took one slow breath of mountain air and got ready to strike. The silence on the line thickened. I didn't fill it with reassurance, and I didn't fill it with anger. I held the phone and let the dead air sit between us. A man with nothing on his conscience can hold still inside the quiet. A man buried under his own deceptions will always start talking to escape the pressure of it. Caden was not a man at peace. He was a trapped thing in an expensive suit. I heard a long, unsteady exhale push through the line. The city noise in the background seemed to recede like he'd cupped the phone tighter against his face. When his voice returned, the hostility had drained out of it. What replaced it was something greased and careful, the deliberate patience of someone who thinks he's explaining something obvious to someone slow. "Look, Dad." The words came measured, each one set down like he was speaking to a stubborn child. "I know you're probably still upset about last night. I know Serena can come across as a little intense, but you need to see past that and look at what's actually at stake here. You need to stop being so deeply selfish and consider what's actually happening. We are building something. Serena's family carries real weight. They have expectations around how things are done. I can't bring her back to some cramped apartment and call it a life. The downtown condo was a necessary move to hold our standing in her circle. The wedding had to be what it was, the social event of the season. He was framing bankruptcy as strategy. He was genuinely trying to sell me on the idea that burning through money neither of them had was a form of investment. I breathed in the cold air and let him keep going. The banking system, he went on, doesn't move at the speed this deal required. His voice began accelerating again as the panic leaked back in through the cracks. The wedding planners and the real estate brokers demanded cash in advance. Serena had told people they were liquid. He'd had to go to private lenders to cover the gap with bridge loans, short-term, just meant to carry them until the commercial sale came through. But the interest on those loans was compounding every single day. Private lenders, he reminded me, don't operate the way banks do. There are no courteous notices in the mail. They were calling his personal phone every hour on the hour, and they weren't leaving messages. They wanted their money now. He paused there, expecting a question from me, something like, how does he intend to satisfy a private lender? I gave him nothing. Just the sound of the morning air moving through my lungs. That silence pushed him forward on his own momentum. He'd already mentioned the commercial developers, he said, rushing to fill the void. Summit Commercial Developments. They had been working to acquire land in the county for the past 3 years, building out a luxury resort and golf course concept. He'd reached out to their acquisitions team 6 months ago, shown them topography maps of the southern pastures. They were very interested. They came back with a strong number for the entire lower half of the ranch. That sale, he said, was the one that paid everything off. That money clears the condo. It sets Serena and me up permanently. He was selling the land. My land. The ground I had turned and fenced and bled over with my own hands. He was brokering the destruction of the southern pastures, so some corporation could lay down a golf course for people like Clifford and Georgette Prescott to walk around feeling important on. But here's the reality, Dad. His tone hardened into something cold and rehearsed. Summit needs the physical original deed to clear the title insurance. The executives are expecting me to walk into their downtown office this Friday and put that document in their hands. Without it, the deal dies. If the deal dies, the private lenders execute their lien. And do you have any idea what they hold a lien against? Do you know what I put up as collateral to get those loans in the first place? He wanted shock. He wanted me rattled. I watched the cattle working along the tree line in the distance. The sun had cleared the mountains entirely, now flooding the valley in a flat, hard light. I said nothing. I used the ranch. He said it the way a man says something he has been waiting a long time to say, his voice loaded with a sickening pride. I leveraged the entire property. The pastures, the barn, the main house, every acre attached to it. He left the words sitting there between us, certain he had just detonated something inside me. He genuinely believed he was holding the winning hand. He believed he'd outmaneuvered a simple old man. I know this is hard to hear. He pressed on, his confidence expanding with each sentence. I know you like to think of yourself as the king of that little dirt patch. But the legal facts are what they are today. You're living in a past that doesn't exist anymore, clinging to something that's already gone. When Mom died, that property came to me. She was the one who ran the business. She was the one who handled the finances. It was her family's money that purchased the land originally. You were the labor, just the farmhand who patched fences and fed the livestock. I let my eyes close for a moment. The sheer delusion packed into those words was extraordinary. Marlene and I had started with nothing. We built what we had through sheer force of will and decades of work that would have ground most people down to dust. She managed the accounts because numbers were her gift, but every dollar we ever accumulated was earned together. We were equal in every way that mattered. Caden had rewritten the whole story to fit what he needed it to be. In his revision, his mother was a quiet heiress who had carried a bumbling husband along out of kindness, and I was a glorified caretaker allowed to sleep in the main house as an act of charity. The title transferred to me when she died, he announced with the serene certainty of someone who has repeated a lie long enough to believe it completely. I kept you on out of pity. I let you keep playing rancher because you had nothing else and nowhere to go. He continued, he'd been paying the property taxes, managing the estate. The land was his, entirely his. He had every legal right to leverage it and every legal right to sell it. As for me, I had no claim whatsoever to the ground beneath my own boots. He drew a breath, the breath of a man who believes he has won. He had laid out his distorted version of reality in full. He was sure he had me cornered. My silence in his reading was the quiet of a man who had finally grasped that he was powerless. So here's how this plays out. His voice flattened into something authoritative and rehearsed. You are going to get up from wherever you're sitting. You are going to walk inside and open that old safe in your office. You are going to take out the property deed and set it on the kitchen counter. Then you are going to go down to the main iron gates and open them for my surveyor. No scenes, no interference. He paused a beat, letting what came next carry full weight. If you cooperate, I'll allow you to stay in the main house until I close on the northern acres next year. If you decide to fight me on this, the private lenders will have you removed by end of month. You'll walk away with nothing but the shirt on your back. Don't make me destroy your life over a single piece of paper. Do you understand the position you are in? I opened my eyes and looked up at the wide Montana sky, bright and empty and perfectly still. He had spent every round he had. He'd laid every card face up on the table without a single one held in reserve. He'd confessed to financial recklessness on a staggering scale. He'd confessed to leveraging property he was certain was his. He'd confessed to his plan to sell my life's work to commercial developers to paper over his own vanity. And in doing all of that, he had exposed the single foundational delusion that was going to bring everything down around him. He genuinely believed he owned this ranch. I set the ceramic mug down on the wooden porch floor. I straightened up in the rocking chair. The time for listening was done. He had asked whether I understood the situation I was in. I pressed the phone to my ear and got ready to answer him. Caden finally ran dry. I could hear him breathing hard on the other end, chest, working lungs, laboring after burning through everything he had. The aggressive momentum that had carried his tirade this far was gone. He had thrown every threat and every demand he owned at something that didn't move, and now he was simply waiting to hear me fold. He was fully expecting me to break. He believed the posturing had done its job and secured the outcome. I let the silence stretch out across all the miles between my quiet valley and his city. I wanted that dead air to settle over him. I wanted him to sit inside the hollowness of where he stood before I took it apart piece by piece. I reached down and lifted the heavy ceramic mug up from the porch boards. The coffee had gone lukewarm in the cold air, but the bite of it was exactly right. I took a long, measured sip and let it settle. Then I pressed the phone firmly against my ear. My voice didn't rise. There was no edge of rage in it, no performance. Just the level, unhurried authority of a man who owns the ground he's standing on. I told him to hear me clearly because I wasn't going to repeat myself. 4 words. You own absolutely nothing. The line went silent in a way that felt different from before. Somewhere behind him, faint and far off, a siren moved through the city. But Caden himself had gone completely still. The bluster was gone, evaporated like morning frost. I gave him no time to regroup, no opening to argue or retreat back into his delusions. I began methodically, and without mercy, to dismantle the fiction he had been living inside for the past 10 years. His mother was a brilliant woman, I told him. Marlene managed the books because she had a precise and disciplined mind for it. But every single acre of this valley was bought with money we made together as equal partners in every sense. When she died, she did not leave the ranch to him. She left everything to her husband. My name is the only name on the master deed. My signature is the only one that carries legal weight in this county. He was never the owner of the land he grew up on. He was a guest who had badly misjudged both his standing and his welcome. I heard something come out of him, then soft, involuntary. The sound of a man feeling the ground go out from under him. The full scale of what he had done was starting to land. I kept going. No pause, no softening. I told him that his mother would be ashamed of what he had turned into. Marlene had spent years clearing brush and running wire in the cold, so we could build something real out of this valley. She didn't pour herself into that work, so he could stake it in a game of social climbing. And whatever he had signed with those private lenders, I told him, was fraudulent from the first page. What I was about to learn about what my own son had truly set in motion behind my back was something I hadn't let myself fully imagine until that moment. The scale of the betrayal was only just coming into the light. I want to ask you something before we go further. If someone you had raised and loved had been quietly working against everything you built, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and let the truth do the work on its own terms? Leveraging property he had no legal claim to was a federal offense, I told him. When he put his signature on those loan documents and declared himself the title holder, he committed wire fraud and bank fraud in the same stroke. The private lenders he'd gone to weren't the sort who would sit back and weigh his social standing or admire the cut of his designer tuxedo. These were people who would gut his luxury condominium down to the bare studs and walk away with the keys to his imported cars, just to cover the interest. The bridging loans he'd taken out to throw his extravagant wedding, those were entirely his burden to carry. Summit Commercial Developments would never lay eyes on a single acre of my southern pastures, I told him. That sale was dead on arrival. The commercial executives he'd been working so hard to impress were going to find out soon enough that they'd been dealing with a desperate man running a con. And the surveyors he'd dispatched, they were not welcome on my land. Caden began to stammer. His voice shrank to something thin and fractured. He tried to say my name. He tried to form a question. He sounded the way a child sounds when he realizes he has stepped into something from which there is no stepping back. The tracks beneath his feet, the freight bearing down fast. He forced out a plea. I couldn't do this to him, he said. The private lenders were dangerous. Serena would leave him the moment the money evaporated. I cut him off before he could finish burying himself any further. No courier was coming to my door, I told him. No surveyors, no real estate brokers. Anyone who set foot on this property without my explicit written authorization would be arrested for trespassing before they reached the porch. He had made his choice at the country club the previous night. He had chosen his toxic bride and her hollow world. Let Clifford and Georgette Prescott cover his debts, I told him, since belonging to their family was apparently worth everything he had. Then I pulled the phone from my ear. My thumb found the red button. The call ended. I held down the power switch until the screen went dark and stayed dark. I laid the dead device face down on the small wooden table beside the rocking chair. The line was cut. The tether between my son and me severed, and with no plans to restore it. The morning sat perfectly still around me. I settled back and looked out across the property, and I knew exactly what was unfolding in the city at that moment. I could picture Caden standing there staring at his phone, the color draining clean out of his face. The full weight of his situation was falling on him all at once. The way a structure collapses first. One point gives, then everything follows. He was standing in a luxury apartment he had no way to keep paying for beside a woman who would vanish the moment she understood the wealth was theater. His whole identity had been constructed on a fiction, the powerful landowner, the man of means. That fiction was done. The private loan sharks weren't going to wait. The bridging loans would default within days, and the debt he had stacked up was going to swallow everything he thought he had. The creditors would be on his personal phone within the hour. The bank would freeze his accounts exactly as he had predicted they would. The wedding vendors who'd been promised payment out of those bridge loans would start filing claims against him. The development team at Summit would soon learn he had tried to sell them land he never owned. The whole fraudulent structure he had built was coming apart simultaneously, and there was no one to point to but himself. He had constructed his own collapse by deciding I was a feeble and uninformed old man. Something settled over me then, a deep spreading quiet, like a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying, had finally been set down. For years I had lost sleep over my son's choices. I had absorbed his girlfriend's contempt and her parents' condescension. I had held my tongue to preserve something that was already gone. The family had ended long before last night. It ended the moment those reception doors swung shut behind me. I got up from the rocking chair. My old border collie stretched and rose alongside me, tail moving. I came down the porch steps and put my boots on the cold morning grass. There was fencing to repair horses, to feed a full working ranch waiting on me. Whatever chaos was consuming a bankrupt fraud in the city was no longer my problem to carry. I headed toward the large, weathered gray barn, drawing in the smell of pine and damp soil with each step. This valley was mine. It had always been mine. Every stone, every water, right, every acre of it recorded under my name. The reckoning was in motion, and there was nothing Caden or his arrogant bride could do to pull themselves clear of what they had set in motion. I stepped into the cool shadow of the barn and picked up my morning chores, feeling for the first time in years genuinely free. The day unfolded precisely as I expected it to. I didn't waste the morning on the porch watching for smoke signals from the city. I went straight to the northern pasture and started working through a stretch of fence that needed attention. Physical work has its own logic, a rhythm that pulls you into the present and keeps you there. Before I'd headed out to the fields, though I had taken one necessary precaution. I'd driven down to the main entrance and threaded a thick steel padlock through the chain on the heavy iron gates. Those gates had stood open for decades. Neighbors and friends had come and gone through them without a second thought. Not today. I understood that the panic I'd unleashed in the city would have to go somewhere, and eventually it would point itself toward my front door. I just needed to be there when it arrived. It came just before noon. I was dragging a sleeve across my forehead when I caught sight of the dust column rising off the long, unpaved county road, a vehicle moving hard and fast, hammering over the ruts and rocks without slowing down. As it closed the distance, I made out the sleek black shape of a luxury SUV, the kind of machine built for valets and smooth pavement, with no business whatsoever on a working ranch road. The driver was punishing that expensive suspension with every mile. I calmly gathered my tools. I got into the old farm truck and drove at an easy pace down toward the main entrance. I wanted to be standing at the gate when they arrived. The black SUV skidded hard to a stop just short of the locked iron bars, throwing up a dense cloud of pale dust that settled across the shining hood and packed itself into the polished grille. The driver's door opened before the engine had even gone quiet. Caden stepped out into the full afternoon glare. The custom tuxedo was gone, replaced by expensive casual clothes that looked just as out of place against the raw backdrop of the valley. His face was flushed deep and uneven, his breathing labored. The passenger door opened a beat later. Serena stepped out onto the gravel in pointed shoes and a fine silk blouse, clothing designed for a different world, entirely now dusted with the grit swirling around her ankles. The polished, imperious woman from the country club had been replaced by someone rawer and more desperate, a woman who had just watched her financial lifeline go dark. I parked the truck about 50 feet back from the gate. I got out and covered the rest of the distance on foot, stopping on my side of the solid iron bars with my hands in my pockets. I offered nothing, no words, no movement. I simply stood and watched the two of them come apart. Caden seized the gate with both hands and threw his weight into it, shaking, pulling, doing nothing to the iron except making noise. The padlock held the chain without comment. He shouted my name and demanded I open it immediately. His voice rang out across the open field and dissolved into the size of the Montana mountains around it, thin and small against all that space. I made no move toward my keys. I did not step forward. I watched the panic work its way through him. When it became clear that force had nothing to offer, he fell back on the only remaining option he could think of. He put his face between the bars and told me I was making a monumental mistake. He told me to stop playing these insane games. The commercial surveyors were sitting in a hotel downtown, waiting on his call, he said, and every hour I held things up was bleeding him thousands of dollars. He claimed I was in the middle of a severe mental breakdown and warned he would hold me personally liable for the financial damage. Before his threats had even finished landing, Serena shouldered her way to the front of the gate. She pushed Caden aside with a frustrated snarl. Whatever veneer of high society composure she normally wore had dissolved entirely. Her eyes had gone wide and unsteady. Her makeup was streaked from the sweat and tension of the long, frantic drive out from the city. Both hands wrapped around the iron bars, and she started screaming at a pitch that cut straight across the open air. She had stopped caring about hiding what she thought of me. A delusional and pathetic old man, she called me. She screamed that I had no legal right to lock them off their own property. She jabbed a finger through the bars and declared the ranch belonged to Caden entirely. His mother had left it to him. She insisted I was nothing but a squatter who had lost his grip on reality. I was a jealous, bitter failure trying to drag my son down because I couldn't stomach watching him move in a world I would never be part of. She demanded I open the gate that instant, or she would call the authorities and have me removed by force. I stood there and listened to every word without so much as a change in expression. There was something almost worth studying in her performance. A woman on the wrong side of a locked gate barking orders at an empire she assumed was hers by marriage alone. She had somehow convinced herself that volume and contempt were a kind of currency, that enough of both would make the ground shift. She had used that approach on Caden for years and watched it work. It had made him pliable. It would not make me move. Caden surged back into it, drawing energy off his wife's fury. He wasn't asking anymore, he shouted. He was coming through one way or another. He threatened to drive straight through the iron barrier if I didn't produce the key. I was out of touch with reality, he screamed, and he was taking control of the situation. He pounded his fists against the metal, a dull, repetitive clanging that sent a handful of birds lifting out of the nearby trees. The two of them together were a spectacle, a pair of grown adults staging the kind of tantrum children throw when they're told the expensive thing they want isn't theirs. I held my silence and didn't move. I looked at the dark ruts their vehicle had gouged into my dirt road. I looked at the fine dust coating their expensive clothes. They were completely outside their world, and they knew it. They had driven 2 hours on nothing but desperation and adrenaline to beat their hands against a gate they had no power to open. They hadn't come to repair anything. There was no apology in them, no thought of the family they had broken the night before. They came because the loan sharks were circling their building in the city, and the accounts were draining fast. They came to bully someone they had decided was defenseless. Serena's voice climbed higher, veering into something close to hysteria. She shrieked that I was sick in the head. No one would take the word of a crazy old farmer over a successful young couple, she promised. They would drag me into court and lay my delusions out in front of the whole world. I would die alone in a state facility with nothing to show for my life. The words were engineered for maximum damage, designed to find a crack in me, force panic, and shake the keys loose. But they rested on a complete ignorance of who I was and what I actually held. I looked at her directly. I let her see what was behind my eyes, not anger, not fear. The cold, settled quiet of a man who has nothing left to prove. I didn't argue about the property. I didn't make a case for my own mental soundness. I stood there the way the gate stood, solid, immovable, unmoved. The iron between us was a more complete answer than any sentence I could have spoken. They were on the outside, pressing against something that would not give, and somewhere in the noise they were beginning to understand that the only rope attached to any lifeboat was in my hand. That gate was a border between two entirely different realities. I watched the dust finish settling around the wheels of their vehicle. Caden had stopped shaking the bars. His hands were red from the effort, sore from throwing himself at steel that didn't notice. He stumbled back a step and dragged a hand across his sweating forehead. The wild, frantic energy he'd arrived with was curdling into something else, something colder and more deliberate. He looked at Serena, who still gripped the bars, chest heaving. Something passed between them in that glance. I recognized it immediately. It was the look of two people who have tried force, watched it fail, and are now calculating a different kind of attack. Caden pulled himself upright and smoothed the front of his shirt, reaching for whatever remained of his composure. He stepped back to the gate, took hold of the iron with both hands, and pressed his face as close to the gap as it would go. When he spoke this time, the shrieking was gone. What replaced it was measured and deliberate, a man trying on the voice of someone dangerous. He told me I'd made my point. I'd thrown my little tantrum, shown the world how bitter and resentful I was. But then his voice dropped to a low, unhurried register that carried clearly across the few feet of air between us. What I was doing today wasn't stubbornness, he said. It was evidence of serious cognitive decline. He held my gaze and laid it out with clinical precision, my delusions about owning the valley, my fabricated claims about the deed, my irrational hostility toward my own family, textbook symptoms, he said, of advanced senility. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I let him construct his entire scheme out loud in front of me. He wasn't going to let a mentally incompetent old man blow up his commercial deal, he said. He was going to drive back to the city and retain the most aggressive medical attorneys available to him or to the money he still believed he had. He was filing an emergency petition for adult guardianship before the courthouse closed that afternoon. He would stand before a judge and testify that his father had lost his mind. He would tell the court I was a danger to myself and to the estate he claimed to own. Serena moved in beside him, something bright and poisonous behind her eyes. She leaned into the bars and added her piece with a thin, satisfied smile. State facilities for court-designated wards weren't comfortable places, she told me. Small rooms, locked doors, barred windows. No going outside, no mountains, no morning air. Bland food on plastic trays, apathetic staff, and four walls to stare at. They would take my truck, my boots, everything I was accustomed to. She promised I would spend whatever time I had left looking at a blank ceiling while they scraped my pastures flat and built a golf course over what was left of my life. Caden nodded along his face, settling into an expression of ugly satisfaction. Once the judge granted guardianship, he explained he'd have full control over every aspect of my life. He wouldn't even need my signature on the deed. The court would grant him authority to execute documents on my behalf. He would have the local sheriff bring a medical transport van to the ranch and have me carried off the property by force. Strapped to a gurney, he said, removed like something dangerous. He gave me a final ultimatum. 60 seconds. Walk to the gate, put the key in the lock, and hand over the property documents. Do that, and he would allow me to stay on the ranch. He promised to drop the medical guardianship and let me live out my remaining years undisturbed. But if I kept that gate shut, he swore on everything holy that he would spend every waking hour engineering my declaration as legally incompetent and having me warehoused in a state facility. The air between us seemed to crystallize. That threat settled over the dirt road like something dense and immovable. This was no longer a quarrel over an unpaid catering invoice or wounded pride at a wedding reception. This was no longer simply about a reckless boy trying to bury his catastrophic financial obligations. The conflict had transformed into something altogether darker. They were actively scheming to strip away my most basic human rights. They wanted to seize my mind, my agency, and my freedom just to pull themselves back from the edge of ruin. They were prepared to lock their own father inside a psychiatric ward and leave him to wither all to get their hands on the land he had spent his entire life earning. Something fundamental shifted deep inside my chest. Whatever microscopic trace of fatherly forgiveness I might have quietly carried was burned away in an instant. The man standing on the far side of that iron gate was not my son. He was a dangerous parasite who had just declared open war on my existence. He had stepped across a line that went well beyond simple disrespect. He had come for the very foundation of who I was. I didn't shout back at him. I didn't bother arguing that my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. I didn't waste a syllable explaining that his legal threats were built on a fabricated premise. A man who knows he's holding a loaded weapon has no need to advertise the ammunition. I simply looked at the two of them clutching those iron bars. I fixed the arrogance in their eyes and the cruelty in their voices into my memory. I wanted to carry the precise image of how they looked in that moment of towering, misplaced confidence. Then I did the one thing that could truly hollow them out. I turned my back on them. Not a word left my mouth. I pivoted slowly, gravel shifting and grinding beneath the heavy soles of my boots. I walked away from the gate with a steady, unhurried stride. I didn't glance over my shoulder. I didn't pick up my pace. I moved with the quiet authority of a man who has complete dominion over his own ground. The reaction was immediate. Every ounce of cold confidence Caden had just put on display collapsed the moment he understood I was leaving. He grasped that his ultimate weapon, his threat to cart me off to a medical facility, hadn't produced so much as a tremor of fear. It hadn't touched my resolve in the slightest. It had earned him nothing but my absolute and total dismissal. He started screaming. The cool, measured drawl he'd arrived with evaporated, entirely replaced by a thin and frantic shriek. He seized the iron bars and shook them with frenzied, desperate force. He shouted my name again and again, his voice cracking under the strain. He demanded I turn around. He ordered me to come back and face him. He screamed that this was no bluff and that a medical transport van would arrive before the sun went down. Serena joined in her voice, climbing toward pure hysteria. She screamed that I was a dead man walking. She shrieked that they would bring in bulldozers and level the cabin with everything I owned still inside. They had come completely unraveled, hurling every verbal weapon they could lay hands on, praying something would make me stop and look back. I reached the driver's side of my old farm truck. The metal door handle had gone warm from sitting in the midday sun. I pulled it open and climbed up into the cab, settling onto the worn bench seat. I rolled the window up, sealing the noise out entirely. I turned the key, and the old engine caught and rumbled to life, a deep, steady growl that swallowed the frantic wailing from the gate without effort. I put the truck in gear and eased down on the accelerator. I drove away from the main entrance and left them standing in a rolling cloud of my dust. I watched them shrink in the rearview mirror, growing smaller and smaller, until they were nothing but two tiny, frenzied shapes pressed against locked iron. The drive back up to the main cabin felt nothing like the drive down. The air inside that cab was dense with purpose. Caden had believed his threat of institutionalization would bring me to my knees. Instead, it had forced my hand entirely. He had pushed the situation to a level that now demanded complete and absolute annihilation. I parked beside the porch and killed the engine. I sat in the stillness a moment, the cool leather of the steering wheel resting under my calloused palms. They wanted to weaponize the legal system against me. They wanted boardrooms and attorneys and fine-print loopholes to steal my valley and seal me in a cage. I understood right then that keeping the gate locked was no longer a sufficient answer. I couldn't simply outlast them. I had to meet them on their own ground and reduce it to ash. It was time to bring the full weight of my empire to bear. It was time to call a man who knew how to dismantle a life using nothing but ink and paper. I pushed the truck door open and stepped out into the sharp mountain air, ready to set the final sequence in motion. The wooden boards of the porch groaned under my boots as I crossed to the front door. A hard mountain wind was cutting across the valley, but the moment I stepped inside, the deep quiet of the cabin wrapped around me like something solid and protective. The air within was completely still. It carried the scent of old leather, dark roasted coffee, and the warm, familiar smell of pine burning in the hearth. I shut the front door and turned the lock, firmly closing out the frantic and pathetic world Caden was currently drowning in. I didn't reach for the hallway lights. I knew every inch of this house without them. I walked straight past the kitchen, where Marlene and I used to map out our future over simple breakfasts, and I made my way to the small room at the very back, my personal office. To anyone peering in through the window, it looked precisely like the workspace of a worn-down, struggling farmer. A scuffed oak desk, a cracked armrest leather chair, wooden shelves packed with dusty agricultural manuals and outdated farming magazines. The perfect disguise. The exact picture Caden and his arrogant bride had always expected to find. But behind the heavy oak bookcase bolted to the far wall lay the full and staggering truth of my life. I crossed the room and reached my calloused hand behind a row of thick encyclopedias. I pressed a hidden metal latch set flush into the wood grain. The entire shelf swung outward on a smooth and perfectly silent glide, revealing a massive solid steel vault sunk deep into the concrete foundation of the house. The cold, old gray surface of the safe door felt absolute and unyielding under my fingertips. I reached up and turned the brass combination dial with slow, deliberate care. The numbers I dialed were no arbitrary sequence. They were the precise month and year that Marlene and I had bought our very first bare acre of dirt. The heavy internal locking mechanism released with a deep, satisfying thud that resonated through the silent room. I pulled the thick steel door wide open. Inside that vault, there were no sentimental family albums or dusty childhood keepsakes. The safe was loaded with neat, methodically organized rows of leather-bound folders and towering stacks of official state-stamped legal documents. I reached in and withdrew a heavy black ledger, setting it down carefully at the center of my wooden desk. I clicked on the small brass reading lamp. Warm, golden light spread across the thick parchment pages, illuminating the vast empire I had constructed in complete and total secrecy. Caden had spent his entire adult life committed to a sweeping and convenient lie. He believed his mother and I were simple, unschooled country people who had barely managed to cling to a modest, struggling homestead by the thinnest possible margin. He took my scuffed boots, my calloused hands, and my outdated suits as conclusive proof of my financial failure. He was so thoroughly blinded by his hunger for high society validation that he never once thought to look past his own assumptions. He never asked how the property taxes got paid. He never asked how the equipment stayed maintained. He simply assumed we were barely keeping our heads above water. If my son had ever taken the time to truly study the man who raised him, he would have stumbled onto a terrifying truth. Marlene and I did not merely survive in this hard valley. We quietly, methodically conquered it. When the commercial beef market collapsed in the 1980s and the neighboring family farms fell into tragic foreclosures, we did not panic. We did not go looking for loans. We bought their land outright in cash. When the major timber industry abandoned the northern ridge and left behind thousands of acres of stripped and unwanted forest, we acquired that too. We secured the water rights to every river running down from the peaks. We purchased the mineral rights buried beneath the bedrock. Each time a parcel bordering our property came to market, we took it quietly without drawing a single eye toward us. We dressed and lived like struggling farmers, so we could buy the earth out from beneath the wealthy men who looked straight through us. Over the span of 40 years, the small patch of dirt we'd started with had steadily consumed the entire surrounding valley. I was not some pitiful squatter clinging to a fading memory. I was the sole owner of one of the largest privately held land empires in the whole state of Montana. My net worth wasn't sitting in flashy imported sports cars or gleaming country club fixtures. It was embedded in the thousands of acres of untouched prime real estate that surrounded my cabin on every side. I was a multimillionaire many times over, and my son hadn't the faintest clue. I opened the heavy black ledger and turned to the master deed section. 10 years earlier, not long after Marlene passed, I had watched Caden develop a fixation on money and status that unsettled me. I could see the greed putting down roots inside him. To shield everything we had built, I had quietly restructured the ownership of the original homestead and all the valley land we'd accumulated into a massive corporate holding company. I was its sole and absolute shareholder. My name was the only name with authority over those assets. Caden had been cleanly and legally cut out of every document. He did not own so much as a single grain of sand on this property. A cold, thin smile pulled at the corners of my mouth as I studied the corporate documents sitting under the quiet glow of my desk lamp. I grasped the full and catastrophic scale of the error my son had just committed. When Caden walked into those private lending offices in the city to arrange his high-interest bridging loans, he'd needed collateral. He required a substantial asset to back the hundreds of thousands of dollars he was borrowing to finance his extravagant wedding and his luxury condominium. He had confidently put his name on those loan documents and pledged the ranch as his own personal property. He had sworn under penalty of perjury that he held clear and unencumbered title to the land. But Caden hadn't simply pledged a modest family farm. He had fraudulently pledged assets belonging to a multi-million-dollar corporate holding company to which he had absolutely zero legal connection. His offense didn't stop at arrogance on a wedding day. He had committed textbook federal wire and bank fraud. He had fabricated his ownership claim to extract enormous sums from highly dangerous private lenders. His signature on those bridging loan documents was nothing but a forged lie pressed onto a legally binding contract. He believed he was outmaneuvering a senile old man. He thought he was working around a stubborn, worn-out farmhand. In reality, he had walked completely blind into a federal crime. He had pledged a piece of an empire he could never legally touch to loan sharks waiting to be repaid, and he had promised commercial developers a property deed that was sitting safely locked inside my steel vault. The snare he had built around himself was entirely inescapable. He was caught between furious lenders demanding their money and developers expecting a clean, legitimate sale. His whole structure was balanced on a forged signature, and I was holding the only gust of wind required to bring the entire thing down. I closed the heavy black ledger and laid both hands flat on the desk. The period of waiting had ended. It was time to unleash the full and devastating reach of my wealth. I sat in the low light of my office, the open vault before me, the ledger on the desk, carrying absolute proof of everything I had built in silence. Caden had threatened to strip away my freedom and commit me to a medical ward. He had calculated that the legal system could be turned into an instrument to erase me. It was a fatal miscalculation. I reached across the worn oak surface of my desk and picked up my cell phone. I did not call the local sheriff. I did not call a family counselor. I dialed a number I had kept committed to memory for more than 20 years. The line rang twice before the secure connection opened. The man on the other end offered no warm greeting. Harmon Fielding was not the kind of attorney who squandered breath on pleasantries. He was a ruthless and deeply connected corporate lawyer, working out of a high-rise office in the city. Harmon managed the intricate network of shell companies and blind trusts that kept my vast real estate holdings invisible to the outside world. He was a shark in a custom-tailored suit, and he was completely loyal to the man who paid his considerable retainer fees in cash. He picked up by stating only his last name. I leaned back into my leather chair and listened to the crisp edge in his voice. I told him there had been a serious breach of protocol regarding the southern pastures. I explained that my son had stood at my gate and threatened to pursue a fraudulent medical guardianship petition in order to seize control of my assets. I laid out the entire situation with cold, methodical precision. I walked him through the high-interest bridging loans Caden had obtained from private lenders. I detailed how he had forged his claim of ownership over my corporate land and used it as collateral to fund his lavish wedding and his downtown condo. Harmon listened in complete silence. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tap of his expensive pen against his mahogany desk. When I finished laying out Caden's scheme in full, Harmon released a low, dark chuckle. He told me my son was walking blindly into a federal penitentiary. Harmon said we could end this immediately. He offered to draft a sweeping cease and desist order and have it delivered to Caden within the hour. He offered to contact the district attorney and lay wire fraud and bank fraud charges before nightfall. He was ready to drop a legal anvil on Caden and flatten him before he could ever file the medical petition. I told Harmon to stop. I told him we would not be filing a single piece of protective paperwork. We were not going to issue any warning. I explained that if we served Caden with a cease and desist today, he would panic and look for an exit. He'd try to negotiate terms with the private lenders or find a way to redirect the blame onto his new wife. I did not want him running. I wanted him walking willingly into a trap so thorough and so absolute that no amount of climbing could get him out. I instructed Harmon to let Caden push forward with his fraudulent scheme, to let the boy file whatever medical petition he chose to file, to let Caden believe he was prevailing in this war. A man convinced he has the upper hand is a man who stops scanning the ground for what's buried beneath it. I wanted Caden to feel the full intoxicating surge of his false victory right up until the precise moment his entire world gave way. I explained to Harmon that Caden's plan was to use a fraudulent medical guardianship to work around my signature. He intended to persuade a judge that I lacked the capacity to manage my own affairs, thereby stealing legal authority over this corporate structure. Harmon's voice dropped to a dangerously quiet register. He told me that filing a false medical petition to seize corporate assets represented a massive escalation, a move that shifted the situation from mere financial desperation into the territory of a highly organized criminal conspiracy. Harmon offered to send private medical examiners to the ranch that same day to document my cognitive health and preemptively neutralize any court order Caden might attempt. I turned him down without hesitation. I told Harmon we were not playing defense. We were playing for total eradication. If we shut down the medical petition now, Caden would simply regroup and find another angle of attack against everything I had built. He would bleed away at me for the remainder of my life. I needed him fully committed to his fraudulent course of action. I needed him to step so far across the legal threshold that no retreat was possible. I wanted him standing before corporate executives, handing over forged documents, certain he had already won. Then I turned the conversation to the most critical piece of the entire puzzle. I asked Harmon about Summit commercial developments. Caden had boasted openly on the phone that he was scheduled to meet with their executive board that coming Friday. He planned to hand them my forged property deed in exchange for a substantial commercial payout, a sum he believed would cover his disastrous bridging loans and pull him back from the edge of complete ruin. Harmon pulled up his corporate files. He confirmed that Summit Commercial Developments was aggressively pursuing the southern edge of our valley to construct a luxury resort. He noted that their acquisitions department had been in active communication, with Caden believing him to be the rightful heir to the estate. Harmon said he could reach their corporate counsel right then and kill the deal by presenting the authentic holding company records. I gripped the edge of my desk and told Harmon that killing the deal over the phone was far too merciful. I did not want this resolved through courteous exchanges between corporate lawyers. I wanted a public and devastating execution. I reminded Harmon of the enormous financial leverage we held over the commercial real estate market in this state. I reminded him that my holding company controlled the vast majority of the water rights that Summit Commercial Developments desperately needed to bring their resort to life. Without my water, their luxury golf course would be nothing but a dry crater of cracked earth. I gave Harmon his final instructions. I ordered him to contact the executive board of Summit Commercial Developments immediately. I told him to use the full weight of our corporate leverage to secure a closed-door meeting in their main boardroom that Friday. I told him to insist that their most senior executives be present in that room. He was to make clear that the true owner of the valley was prepared at last to sit down and discuss the future of the southern pastures. But there was one specific non-negotiable condition attached to this meeting. I told Harmon to make certain the Summit executives did not cancel their existing appointment with Caden. They were to allow my son and his poisonous bride to walk into that corporate building with no idea the board already knew the full truth. They were to let Caden carry his forged documents and his arrogant smile straight into the lion's den. Harmon absorbed the cold brilliance of the strategy without a word of hesitation. He understood precisely what I was constructing. I was not merely protecting my land. I was assembling a perfect, inescapable stage for my son's total destruction. Harmon promised me the boardroom would be secured. He promised the executives would be seated at the table waiting for the proceedings to begin. He assured me he would personally manage every legal preparation to ensure Caden had no avenue of escape from the federal fraud charges once the trap was sprung. I thanked my attorney and ended the call. I set my phone down beside the heavy black ledger. The invisible mobilization was complete. My son and his cruel wife thought they were preparing to have me committed to a medical ward. They thought they were about to bulldoze my legacy and plunder my fortune to fund their vanity. They had no idea whatsoever that I had just arranged for them to walk directly into a corporate slaughterhouse. I rose from my desk and switched off the small brass reading lamp. I walked out of my office and left the steel vault standing open in the dark. The paperwork was secure. The ambush was set. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a tall glass of cold water. I drank it slowly, feeling the calm, even rhythm of my own pulse. 3 days to wait. 3 days of total silence while Caden marched confidently toward his own reckoning. I looked out the kitchen window at the dark silhouette of the mountains rising against the sky. I had built my empire in the shadows, and on Friday morning I was finally going to let my son see exactly what that darkness contained. The Summit Commercial Developments building was a towering monument to modern corporate excess, a spear of reflective black glass driving upward into the clear Montana sky. I sat in absolute stillness at the far end of their massive executive boardroom. The chair beneath me was upholstered in smooth, imported leather. The long table stretching ahead of me had been cut from a single slab of polished mahogany. I kept my hands folded quietly on the gleaming wood surface. My scuffed leather boots sat flat on the thick designer carpet. The entire front wall of this boardroom was floor-to-ceiling glass, flawlessly transparent, giving me an unobstructed view of the sleek executive reception area just beyond the double doors. I wasn't there to take in the decor. I was there to watch a dead man walking. The digital clock on the wall turned to exactly 9 sucre in the morning. A soft chime carried through the reception area as the private executive elevator announced its arrival. The polished steel doors drew apart with a quiet, mechanical hiss. I watched my son step out onto the top floor of the world he had spent everything trying to conquer. Caden was wearing a brand-new charcoal gray suit that likely cost more than a dependable used tractor. His hair was slicked back and immaculate. He carried his head high, moving with an exaggerated, theatrical swagger. He was projecting the total confidence of a man who believed he was moments from collecting a winning lottery ticket. A sleek, black leather briefcase was tucked under his left arm. I knew precisely what that briefcase held. Inside were the forged property deed and the fraudulent transfer documents he intended to use to steal my valley out from under me. Serena stepped off the elevator right at his side. She was wearing a tailored cream dress that announced unearned wealth and excessive vanity to anyone within eyeshot. She gripped a designer handbag that cost more than most families spend on groceries in a month. Her gaze swept the expansive luxury of the executive reception area with a smug, deeply satisfied expression. She was practically radiating a toxic, triumphant energy. As far as she was concerned, the war was already over. She genuinely believed they had finished off the pathetic, senile old rancher who had dared to humiliate her at her own wedding. She believed they had sealed me away in a cage built from my own irrelevance. She thought she was just minutes from receiving a massive commercial payout that would erase their crushing debt and lift her to the very top of the social order. They hadn't come alone. Moving close behind them was a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting olive suit. He was clutching a thick sheaf of appraisal documents and visibly sweating beneath the bright, recessed lighting of the lobby. I knew exactly who this man was. Harmon had briefed me on him earlier in the week. His name was Dwight, a crooked real estate appraiser with a reputation for inflating land values and looking the other way when the paperwork raised serious questions. Caden had brought him along to push the fraudulent sale through the corporate machinery at speed. Caden believed that having his own corrupt appraiser in the room would guarantee the commercial developers accepted the forged documents without asking anything inconvenient. He thought he was playing a masterful game of corporate chess. I sat in the dim quiet of the boardroom and watched their miserable parade unfold. I observed them approach the main reception desk, where a young woman with a calm and professional manner was waiting. She had been expecting them. Harmon had given her very specific instructions in advance regarding their arrival. I watched Caden lean against the marble counter. I couldn't make out his words through the thick, soundproofed glass, but his body language said everything. He was pressing forward into the receptionist's space, performing dominance, performing importance. He tapped his expensive watch and gestured broadly toward the boardroom doors. He was undoubtedly announcing himself as the powerful landowner who had arrived to finalize the Southern Pasture acquisition, positioning himself as an indispensable partner whose time was not to be wasted. Serena stood at his shoulder, studying her perfectly manicured nails. She looked utterly bored and dismissive of the receptionist. She carried herself with the aura of a woman to whom everything in this building was already owed. She cast occasional glances around the opulent lobby, quietly laying claim in her own mind to the wealth surrounding her. She believed these executives were her equals. She believed she had married a man with the ruthless instincts to conquer the business world. She had absolutely no idea that the man beside her was a desperate bankrupt fraud who was sweating through his expensive undershirt because his private loan sharks were circling his luxury condominium. The bridging loans Caden had taken out to pay for their extravagant wedding were due in under 48 hours. The crushing pressure of that financial avalanche was the invisible force behind all his aggressive posturing. He was performing strength because he was utterly terrified. He needed the executives inside this building to sign a check for millions of dollars before the weekend arrived. If those funds didn't come through, the private lenders would execute their liens, seizing his cars, freezing his accounts, and putting him on the pavement with nothing but the suit he stood in. He was a cornered animal wearing the mask of a king. The crooked appraiser Dwyer shifted his weight nervously from foot to foot. He kept glancing toward the elevator bank as though calculating the fastest way out. He knew the documents inside Caden's briefcase were fraudulent. He knew he was a willing participant in a massive criminal conspiracy. But Caden had likely promised him a generous cut of the commercial payout to secure his corrupt cooperation. Dwyer wiped his damp forehead with a crumpled handkerchief. He was a small and cowardly man about to stumble into a federal trap he could never possibly survive. I remained perfectly motionless in my leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany table. The boardroom was dark, except for a single warm pool of light falling across the center of the table. Harmon Fielding occupied the chair directly to my right. He was working through a thick file of legal documents with the cold and mechanical focus of a seasoned predator. To my left sat three of the most senior executives of Summit Commercial Developments, dressed in dark, conservative suits. They were completely silent. They already knew the full and unvarnished truth. Harmon had briefed them entirely on Caden's fraudulent scheme. They understood that the man currently demanding attention at the reception desk was a criminal attempting to sell them stolen land. They were simply waiting for my signal to open the doors and let the slaughter begin. I watched Caden drag a hand through his slicked-back hair. He turned to Serena and flashed her a wide, confident smile. He probably told her the money was as good as deposited. He probably told her the old man was withering back on the ranch, completely powerless to interfere with their brilliant plan. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted me. They took my refusal to return their frantic calls over the past few days as evidence that I had finally surrendered. They read my silence as the silence of a broken and senile farmer who had accepted his miserable fate. They had no idea that my silence was the silence of a hunter holding still while the trap closed around its prey. I had allowed them to drive all the way downtown. I had allowed them to walk through the lobby of a major corporation. I had allowed them to carry forged documents into a room full of federal witnesses. I had let them climb to the absolute summit of their arrogant illusion, so the fall would shatter them completely. The receptionist gave a polite nod toward the glass. She lifted her desk phone and pressed a single button. The red light blinked on the conference phone at the center of our mahogany table. Harmon reached over and pressed the speaker. The receptionist's voice drifted softly through the quiet boardroom. She announced that Mr. Caden Alcott had arrived for his scheduled meeting regarding the Southern Pastures acquisition. Harmon looked at me and waited for my instruction. I looked through the soundproof glass. Caden was staring directly at the boardroom doors. He was standing tall, practically vibrating with greedy anticipation. He was ready to stride inside and claim his stolen empire. He was ready to put his name on paper and walk out a wealthy man. A deep and settling calm moved through my entire body. I had spent 50 years constructing my legacy through honesty and hard labor, and I was not about to let a parasite dismantle it for vanity. I gave Harmon a slow and deliberate nod. The illusion of grandeur was officially finished. It was time to introduce my son to the full and absolute devastation of reality. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom swung open. Caden and Serena marched inside with their heads raised, fully expecting to conquer the room. I remained entirely still in my leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany table. The lighting was dramatic, throwing long and imposing shadows across the polished wood. Harmon Fielding sat quietly to my right, reviewing a thick stack of legal documents. The three executives from Summit Commercial Developments sat to my left, their expressions completely unreadable. They knew exactly what was coming. Caden strode confidently toward the center of the room, barely registering the people seated around the table. He was too absorbed in his own performance to notice the finer details of his surroundings. He assumed he was the most important person in the room. He walked to the edge of the mahogany table and dropped his sleek black leather briefcase onto the polished surface. The crack of it echoed through the silent boardroom. Serena positioned herself right beside him, arms folded, projecting an aura of supreme and wholly unearned entitlement. Dwyer, the crooked appraiser, hovered anxiously near the doorway, clutching his fraudulent paperwork like a shield. Caden began to speak, his voice loud and artificially smooth. He addressed the room as though he were a conquering king presiding over his court. He announced that he had brought the original deed and the finalized transfer documents for the southern pastures. He declared that he was prepared to sign the paperwork immediately and conclude the commercial transaction. He spoke with the reckless confidence of a desperate man who believed his salvation was already secured. He never once looked at the faces of the men seated across from him. He focused only on the empty space where he expected millions of dollars to appear. I let his arrogant monologue fill the room and hang in the air. I allowed him to reach the absolute peak of his illusion. I watched the frantic energy radiating off his posture. I knew the bridging loans were tightening around his throat. I knew he was hours away from complete financial ruin. He needed this deal to survive. He was standing on a trapdoor that had been fully primed and ready to drop. When Caden finally went quiet, the silence in the boardroom was total and deafening. The three Summit executives offered no warm reception. Not one of them reached for his documents. They simply fixed him with cold and calculating stares. That wall of unbroken silence sent a sudden and visible shockwave through Caden's manufactured confidence. He shifted his weight nervously. He looked to Serena for reassurance, but she was equally thrown by the wordless reception. I leaned forward slowly, moving out of the deep shadows and into the warm pool of light at the center of the table. I pressed my calloused hands flat against the smooth mahogany. The simple movement drew every eye in the room. Caden finally pulled his attention from the executives and fixed it on the man seated at the head of the table. Recognition struck him with the force of a physical blow. The color drained instantly from his face, leaving him pale and completely undone. He staggered backward, catching himself clumsily against the heavy wooden edge of the table. His jaw fell open, but no sound came out. He was looking at the father he had discarded. He was looking at the man he had threatened to commit to a medical ward. He was looking at the pathetic squatter he had believed so easily outsmarted. I was seated in the position of absolute power, wearing a navy blue suit and the same scuffed leather boots he had long considered an embarrassment to his high society world. Serena let out a sharp, trembling gasp. Her perfectly manicured hands flew up to cover her mouth. Every trace of arrogance vanished from her face, replaced by genuine and unfiltered horror. She looked at me then frantically, at the silent executives struggling to comprehend the impossible scene unfolding before her. Dwyer, the crooked appraiser, whimpered audibly and took a terrified step backward toward the heavy oak doors. He had instantly grasped the catastrophic scale of the trap they had all walked into. I offered no greeting. I did not raise my voice or betray a single ounce of anger. I looked directly into my son's terrified eyes. I let him feel the absolute and crushing weight of my presence. He had constructed his entire pathetic empire on a foundation of lies and arrogance. He had believed himself the master of his own fate. Now he was staring directly into the abyss of his own total destruction. The silence was absolute. The execution was about to begin. I did not need to speak a single word to command the room. Harmon Fielding understood the exact timing of the execution. He rose from his leather chair with the slow and methodical composure of a predator preparing to strike. He reached down and lifted the towering stack of thick legal folders he had brought with him. They were bound in heavy dark leather and stamped with the official gold seals of my corporate holding company. The sound of those folders sliding across the polished mahogany broke the heavy silence. Harmon moved around the perimeter of the table, distributing the documents with cold and unhurried precision. He placed one folder in front of each of the three summit executives. They did not open them. They simply rested their hands over the leather covers, serving as silent and impartial witnesses to the slaughter. Harmon continued his slow circuit toward the far end of the table where my son stood waiting. Caden was practically trembling. Every trace of artificial confidence had drained from his body, leaving behind nothing but raw and unfiltered terror. He watched the ruthless attorney close the distance with wide and panicked eyes. Harmon stopped directly in front of him. He did not hand the folder to Caden with any courtesy. He dropped it onto the table with a loud, heavy thud that made Serena flinch backward in her expensive cream dress. Harmon then set a separate, thinner folder squarely in front of Dwyer, the crooked appraiser. Dwyer stared at the crisp white pages as though they were a coiled snake about to strike. Harmon returned to his seat beside me and folded his hands, perfectly mirroring my own posture. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on my son. I told him to open the folder. My voice was low and measured, but it carried the undeniable weight of something immense preparing to fall. Caden hesitated. His soft, manicured hands were trembling so badly he could barely grip the edge of the leather cover. He slowly turned it open. His eyes moved across the dense pages of corporate structures and legal ownership transfers. He was frantically searching for an error, a gap, anything that might stop his reality from collapsing beneath him. But there were no errors in Harmon Fielding's paperwork. Every line was airtight and entirely beyond reversal. I gave him time to work through the first few pages before I began to take his life apart. I told him to study the corporate hierarchy laid out in Section 4 of the document. I told him to look at the holding company that controlled the vast valley where he had grown up. I told him to trace the ownership of that holding company up through the corporate structure to me as its sole shareholder. Caden stopped reading. The blood drained entirely from his face, turning his skin the color of ash. His lips parted as he struggled to draw air into his tightening chest. He lifted his eyes to mine with an expression of absolute devastation. The arrogant groom who had banished me from his own wedding reception was gone, and he was not coming back. I laid out the reality of his position with surgical precision. I told him that I did not merely own the dirt beneath his boots. I told him I was the primary financial backer and the majority shareholder of Summit Commercial Developments. I told him that the executives sitting quietly to my left were my direct employees. They answered to me and no one else. I described how I had watched him reach out to the acquisitions department 6 months prior. I told him how I had personally directed my corporate officers to indulge his delusion every step of the way. I had ordered them to bring him into this building to dangle a massive commercial payout before him, and to let him carry his forged documents straight into the heart of my own company. Serena began breathing in shallow, ragged pulls of air. She pressed her expensive designer handbag against her chest, as if it were a shield against the financial ruin crashing over them both. Her eyes swept to the three silent executives, silently pleading with them to contradict what I had just said. She wanted someone to laugh and tell her this was a terrible misunderstanding. They offered her nothing. They remained perfectly still, their unbroken silence confirming every word I had spoken. I returned my attention to Caden. I told him to sit with the precise nature of the crime he was in the process of committing. I directed his attention to the sleek black briefcase sitting on the mahogany table. I told him it contained a forged property deed bearing a fraudulent signature. I reminded him that he had walked into a corporate headquarters with the intention of selling stolen land to a multi-million-dollar development firm. I laid out the brutal irony of his master plan, so everyone seated in that room could absorb it fully. I told him he was attempting to sell my own land back to my own company, using my forged signature to collect a payout drawn from my own corporate treasury. I let the staggering weight of that truth settle into the silence of the boardroom. I told him he had not simply deceived his arrogant bride or his wealthy in-laws. He had walked into a room populated by corporate attorneys and executive witnesses to commit textbook federal fraud. Dwyer the appraiser could not withstand the crushing pressure a moment longer. The thin folder Harmas had placed before him contained a thorough record of his prior corrupt appraisals and a drafted confession prepared for the authorities. Dwyer whimpered and pushed back from the mahogany table. He muttered a pathetic apology and moved quickly toward the boardroom doors, desperate to put distance between himself and the wreckage. I made no move to stop him. He was a minor parasite, and his cowardly exit only stripped my son of another ally driving home just how completely alone he now stood. I leaned forward, pressing my weight against the heavy table. I dropped my voice low, making certain every word landed directly in Caden's chest. I told him about the bridging loans. I told him I knew the precise sum he had borrowed from the private lenders in the city. I told him I knew he had used the forged ranch deed as collateral to bankroll the extravagant wedding and the luxury downtown condominium. I watched his eyes go wide with sheer panic as I dismantled his most closely guarded financial secrets in front of the very people he had come here to impress. I told him the trap was now completely shut. There was no exit. The commercial sale he had relied on to save himself was dead. Summit Commercial Developments would never execute a contract with a desperate fraud. The massive payout he had guaranteed his private lenders was never going to materialize. I explained that the bridging loans would go into default within days, and the loan sharks would move immediately to execute their liens. They would take the luxury vehicles, the expensive wardrobe, and the downtown condo. They would strip away every superficial object he had assembled to construct his fabricated identity. I told him his violent creditors would soon discover that the collateral he had put forward was entirely without value. I told him that when those private lenders realized he had deceived them about owning the valley, they would not pursue him through civil court. They would come for him in the streets. I told him he was utterly and completely bankrupt in every sense the word could carry. Caden looked at me through eyes filled with a hollow and terrifying despair. He finally grasped the absolute precision of the ambush. He had driven all the way to the city in his finest suit, convinced he had conquered the world. He believed he had shoved a senile old farmer out of his path to claim what was rightfully his. Instead, he had walked willingly into a meticulously constructed execution chamber. Every lie he had ever told, every document he had ever forged, every threat he had ever made had been catalogued, examined, and built into the very cage now locked around him. The boardroom held its stillness. The executives watched the complete unraveling of a fraudulent man without expression. Harmon Fielding sat quietly at my right, awaiting my final instruction. I looked at the son who had thrown me away, the son who had threatened to rob me of my freedom and confine me to a sterile medical ward. He had nothing left to his name. The paper record of his ruin was spread across the polished wood, sealing his fate in cold and unanswerable ink. I settled back into my leather chair and let the crushing silence do its work. I looked at the hollowed-out man standing at the edge of the mahogany table. Harmon Fielding did not wait for a command. He reached across the polished surface and pressed a thick manila envelope into Caden's trembling hands. The envelope held no commercial contract and no corporate payout. It contained a meticulously assembled record of every fraudulent document Caden had ever signed. It held copies of the bridging loans he had secured under false pretenses. It held the forged signatures he had used to leverage a valley he had never owned. I told him to open the envelope and look at his own destruction. I wanted him to see with his own eyes the exactness of the legal trap he had entered. Caden could barely manage the paper. His fingers shook so badly that the crisp white sheets rattled against each other in the silent room. He stared at the evidence of his own federal crimes, and a quiet, wretched sound escaped his throat. I kept my voice low and completely stripped of emotion. I told him that my holding company had already assembled the evidence required for a federal indictment. I explained that the executives at the table were prepared to hand that envelope to the district attorney the instant I gave the order. I told him that forging a signature on a multi-million-dollar real estate transaction carries a mandatory prison sentence. I let the reality of a federal penitentiary take root in his mind. I told him I was going to offer him exactly one microscopic shred of mercy and that it was the very last thing he would ever receive from me. I laid it out for him. Plainly, the criminal charges would stay buried, and the federal prosecutors would never hear his name, but only under one absolute non-negotiable condition. He would walk out of that building and disappear from my life completely. No calls to my phone, no car turning down my county road, no whisper of my name passing his lips. Not a single blade of grass in my valley would he ever attempt to claim for whatever years remained to him on this earth. Should he break that condition, even once I assured him that Harmon Fielding would personally hand the fraud documentation to a federal judge, and Caden would spend the prime years of his life staring at concrete walls. The sheer weight of that ultimatum ground down whatever arrogance he still had inside him. But the criminal threat was only the first half of what awaited him. I moved on methodically to the financial wreckage that was already closing in. Without the commercial payout, his high-interest bridging loans would hit default before the week was out. I made sure he understood that. The private lenders he'd gone to were not reasonable people, they were ruthless, and they had no interest in patience. They would freeze every account he held. His imported luxury cars would be repossessed. The expensive downtown condominium would be foreclosed on and stripped bare. Every designer piece he'd ever acquired would be gone. His credit was dust, and the moment the checks started bouncing, whatever reputation he'd built in the city would evaporate overnight. He was completely, thoroughly bankrupt. He was heading straight back to the dirt he'd clawed so desperately to escape, only this time there would be nothing whatsoever waiting for him there. That was when Serena finally broke. The weight of the catastrophe came down on her all at once, and she let out a loud, wretched sob that rang out across the silent boardroom. Dark rivulets of tears carved through her flawless makeup and streaked down her flushed cheeks. The way she looked at Caden in that moment held no love, no sympathy, nothing but raw, undiluted disgust. It hit her right then. She had bound herself to a penniless fraud. The luxury vacations, the high society dinners, the glittering life she had imagined, all of it dissolving before her eyes. She was the wife of a bankrupt criminal, and every wealthy circle she'd ever coveted would slam its doors on her permanently. She took several steps back, clutching her expensive handbag as though it were the last thing of value she would ever hold. She screamed at him, called him a liar, a failure, a pathetic excuse for a man. She told him he had gutted her life and obliterated her standing. Every ounce of her vicious vanity turned against the man she had so recently married. Caden didn't even glance at his weeping bride. He set the envelope of evidence on the table and dropped to his knees right there on the thick designer carpet. The same arrogant groom who had thrown me out of his wedding reception was now on the floor of a boardroom begging a simple rancher for salvation. He sobbed without restraint, pleading with me to pay off the private lenders, begging me to sign the commercial deal and spare him from the loan sharks who would come collecting. He cried out that I was his father, that I couldn't let his life end like this. He reached his hands up toward me, grasping for the unconditional financial rescue he had counted on his entire life. He made promises. He swore he would change. He even swore he would leave Serena if I would just clear the debt. I stood there and looked down at the man weeping on the floor. I felt nothing at all. No pity, no sorrow. I told him that a father protects a son, but what I was looking at was a parasite who had tried to steal my legacy and have me locked away in a medical ward. I told him he had made his choice the moment he grabbed my arm at the country club and discarded me in front of a room full of arrogant strangers. His actions had always carried consequences. Now he was finally going to learn what surviving in the real world looks like without anyone to catch him. I rose slowly from my leather chair at the head of the mahogany table, reached down and buttoned my navy blue suit I had purchased 12 years ago, smoothing the fabric with my calloused hands. I turned my back on all of it and walked toward the heavy oak doors. The three corporate executives and Harmon Fielding stood in complete silence, watching me go with unmistakable respect. I didn't pause. I didn't look back. I pushed through those boardroom doors and out into the bright reception area, leaving my sons sobbing on the floor behind me. I stepped into the waiting elevator and pressed the button for the ground floor. The polished steel doors slid shut, sealing off his desperate cries and cutting the last thread between us. I walked out of the corporate building and into the sharp midday sun, leaving the city and every bit of its hollow vanity behind me. The air back in the valley was crisp and clean when I finally pulled in. The sky over Montana stretched wide and brilliant blue in every direction. I parked the old truck beside the wooden porch of my cabin and climbed out onto the familiar ground. My old border collie trotted over and pressed his heavy head against my leg. I reached down and ran my hand through his thick coat, feeling the deep, steady peace that poured off those mountains. I climbed the wooden steps and settled into my heavy rocking chair. I poured a fresh mug of black coffee and let the steam rise warm against my calloused hands. I looked out over the rolling pastures and the dense timber forests running all the way to the horizon. Every acre was mine. The toxic force that had threatened this place was gone for good. The quiet of the ranch no longer pressed down on me like a weight. It was something far better than that. It was a reward, profound and entirely earned. That is where the story ends. Not with noise, not with a celebration, just the quiet of the ranch and the knowledge that it was all still mine. I won't pretend it came without a cost. Letting go of a son, truly letting go, is one of the heaviest things a man can do. But I believe God does not waste suffering. The years of silence, the slow and careful work of building something real, the patience it took to hold back until the right moment, all of it served a purpose I couldn't have seen from the beginning. Father stories like this one don't get told enough. The fathers who endure quietly, who absorb the disrespect, who keep building anyway, they deserve to have their story heard. What happened in that boardroom was about more than land or money. It was about family justice, the kind that doesn't come from a courtroom, but from a man finally standing in the full truth of what he built and refusing to surrender it. If this story taught me anything worth passing on here, is what I would say. Never sign over what you built out of guilt. Love does not require you to hand someone the deed to your life's work. When someone shows you who they are in a moment of public cruelty, believe them, do not wait for a second demonstration. Patience is not weakness. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let a man walk far enough down his own path to reach the consequences at the end of it. If someone has been working against you, gather your proof in silence, then let the truth speak in a room where it cannot be argued with. If this story moved you or made you think of someone in your own life, I hope you'll share it with them. Leave a comment below, I read them, and I want to hear what this brought up for you. And if you haven't subscribed to Alpha Dad Stories yet, now is a good time. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next one.